2020. So this is the second one. But in light of the COVID pandemic experience, there were definitely some lessons learned. And so there's a good reason for the Fed to take this review quite serious. I'm joined here today by Alan Blinder, obviously distinguished professor at Princeton University, former vice chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Carolyn Wilkins, who's a senior research scholar at the Griswold Center, who is also the deputy governor for the Bank of Canada, and she's currently working on Bank of England on the FPC, the Financial Policy Committee for the Bank of England. So she's following Mark Carney's footsteps, not working just for one central bank, but working for two. So let's begin. So way I wanted to start was talk really about why there is even this review in the first place. So the Fed is basically committed to, under Jay Powell, to have a monetary policy framework and to have that framework reviewed every 5 years. And what the framework does is it basically specifies what the Fed's objectives are with respect to employment and inflation. What's the Fed actually trying to accomplish through the monetary policy? Where are they trying to go? Now, the reason why the framework is particularly interesting is that in 2020, when they did the first monetary policy framework review, they made a lot of changes in terms of how they actually conduct monetary policy. Two substantive changes to both sides of the dual mandate objectives. On the employment side, they basically said, we're no longer going to be focused on deviations from full employment. We're now going to be focused on shortfalls from full employment. So going from a two-sided test to a one-sided test. So pretty significant change. So we're going to press to see how far we can go in terms of getting the economy operating at a high level of resource utilization before we start to worry about need to raise interest rates. The second big change was that they moved from always targeting 2% inflation to a more complex model, which was basically if the Fed had missed inflation targets to the downside, so if the target was 2%, but inflation was running 1.5%, they now committed to making up those shortfalls of inflation by overshooting the 2% inflation objective for a while. This is quite a change. Before this, the Fed's policy was a bygones policy. If we miss, we miss, but then next period, we're always trying to hit 2%. So this is a policy that's quite different. You're basically saying if we miss to the downside, we're going to want to make it up on the upside, but not vice versa. The new policy was if we're above 2% inflation, we just want to go back down to 2% inflation. You notice you never heard Jay Powell talk about going below 2% inflation to offset the misses to the upside. So it's an asymmetric process. Now, why did they make these changes? Well, the motivation for these changes was that after the great financial crisis, the U.S. economy was very weak, inflation was very low, and as a consequence of that, the federal funds rate never got very high. So the federal funds rate in 2019 peaked at 2.4%. That was the peak of the federal funds rate for that cycle. And so as a consequence of that, inflation is below where the Fed's trying to hit the target, not dramatically below, but call it 1.5%, 1.75%. And the interest rate's not very high. The Fed was really starting to be concerned that the U.S. could end up in a Japanese-style situation, where basically inflation expectations keep declining, inflation that feeds into inflation falling, monetary policy loses the ability to provide stimulus to get you out of an economic downturn. So how to deal with this problem? Well, let's keep inflation expectations better anchored at 2%. How to do that? Commit to offsetting misses to the downside by misses to the upside. So it's a combination of the experiences post-COVID and the fact that the economy was running soft and inflation was low that I think motivated these changes in the framework. They operationalized this by setting a bunch of conditions for what liftoff what they'd have to see liftoff. Now, formally, the framework is separate from how the Fed actually operationalizes the framework, but I think it's really the same story. Because if you have a framework, you're obviously going to have to operationalize how you carry it out. And they operationalize the framework in a pretty interesting way. They basically said, we're not going to raise short-term interest rates until we're at full employment, we're at 2% inflation, and we're confident that inflation is going to go above 2% for some time in the future, essentially to offset the past misses to the downside. They also have set conditions for ending quantitative easing. We're not going to end quantitative easing until we've made substantial progress to these same three goals. So as a consequence, in the winter, spring of 2022, the federal fund rate was at zero. The Fed was still buying treasuries and agency mortgage-backed securities. Inflation was above 5%, and the unemployment rate was below the Fed's own assessment of full employment. So the Fed was very late to tighten monetary policy. Now I want to turn the story over to Alan.
Okay, I want to start with the principle, which Bill has half answered already, which is if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And the corollary of that is if you're going to go about fixing it, you should look pretty carefully about where it's broken, concentrate your efforts there. And I think the Jay Powell did not edit these remarks, but I think the amount of criticism that the Fed got for this mistake, and it was a mistake, is not commensurate and in fact very much larger than the mistake itself. And I'll make that specific in a second. So if you remember the conditions, we all remember the conditions of the year 2000 when the pandemic was making economies around the world, including our own, nosedive. And the Fed appropriately turned super easy. It put its interest rate, Bill said, to zero, not quite to zero. Pet peeve of mine, they could have and should have gone negative, actually, but they didn't. So they went to very close to zero, 0 to 25 basis points, and they held it there right through March 2022, and that was the mistake, holding it there too long. Not a mistake to go that low. I mean, it was very appropriate for the Fed to throw the kitchen sink, the bathroom sink, the basement sink, the garage sink, everything at the trying to give the economy a boost as it just collapsed over the pandemic. Why were they late to start reversing this policy and moving back to something normal? I think the answer is mainly a bad forecast. And that's why I say we don't want to exaggerate the number of things and the different sorts of things that went wrong at the Fed. The Fed made a bad forecast of where inflation was going, how high it would go, how long it would stay high. And that was the error, that was the main reason for the mistake. Everybody made, I don't want to say everybody, there's always somebody who got it exactly right. I don't know who this was. But basically everybody got it wrong, and everybody got it wrong in the same direction. There's a sentence in a paper I wrote that said, if misery loves company, the Fed had plenty of both. The forecasters across the board, private sector forecasters, other public institutions, other countries had a similar experience, and they were all wrong. What became called team transitory, to which I signed on. I didn't invent the term, I want that to be clear. But I did sign on, and more importantly, the Federal Reserve basically signed on. We're not quite using those words. Saw that the inflation rate would go like this, claimed that the inflation rate would go like this and then like this. And if you're sitting up here someplace, that does not create an immediate need to tighten monetary policy a lot if you think it's going to go down like this on its own accord. What's less known, I thought, it's not a secret, it should be more known, is that is what happened. It just took a longer time than people thought. The inflation rate measured the way the Fed likes to measure it, the PCE inflation rate, that stands for personal consumption expenditure, peaked around 7. And in a year's time, so that was like June, I'm gonna say, I'm not sure I got the month exactly right, of 22, the middle of 22. A year later, it was down below 3. So that's what happened. But it took a lot longer than people thought, and that was the, including the Fed, and that was the source of a lot of the criticism. We shouldn't have, I look back, and again, I want to repeat, I didn't invent the term. We shouldn't have used the term transitory. Because something that lasts a year and a half or something may not look so transitory to a lot of people, and that was a bad term, but the right idea. Now, Bill started talking appropriately about the framework that the Fed published in August of 2020. I think it gets too much blame, and the reason is obvious. As Bill said, the Fed made two changes in the framework, both in the dovish direction. First, it went to 2% average inflation over a period of time and an asymmetric tilt to that. That is, we'll make up for shortfalls, but we won't make up for excessive inflation above 2%. And on the other side of the dual mandate, the employment side, it stated, contrary to where it had been before, that it basically cared about shortfalls of employment from full employment, not worrying about excessive employment that goes above estimates of, say, the natural rate. Well, if it's unemployment below the natural rate of unemployment, or if it's employment above the natural rate of employment. Prior to that, the Fed really hadn't made a big deal of it, but everybody understood it to be symmetric. That if there was, the economy had too much juice, you try to slow it down. If it had too little juice, you try to juice it up in a roughly symmetric way. So what happened in August 2020, everybody thinks that if something comes first and then something comes second, there's causation going in that direction. So what happened in August 2020, the Fed made these two dovish changes in its policy style or framework, they called it. And about a year and a half later, inflation shot up. I don't think the causation is nearly as strong as a lot of people think, although they were both changes in the dovish direction. Last point, if something is broke, we should fix it. What I think is broke is the idea that the Fed should have a point target, regardless of the index they pick, 2.00. I think that's a mistake for two reasons. First, not so important. The second, more important. The less important reason is that no central bank can do that. To think that any central bank on earth can control the inflation rate to the decimal point is to live in a delusion. If you can get within a half a point of your target inflation rate, I think you should ask for a round of applause and applaud well, not applaud yourself, that won't look good. That you're doing very well. I made the classic mistake. I said two reasons, and now I'm fumbling for the sec. Oh yeah. You can't do it, and the effort to do it may lead you astray. And I'm going to give you two examples from the recent Fed history. Bill mentioned this. In the 3 years or so prior to 2020, the inflation rate in the United States, measured the way the Fed likes to measure, was averaged 1.7%. That's not 2. The Fed got exercised about that. We're failing. We're starting to look like Japan. We may have zero inflation for a decade or something. They were missing by 30 basis points, which is way below the ability of any human on earth to detect. This is per year, not per day. You couldn't detect 30 basis points per day. I couldn't anyway, but per year. So that led them into this framework, which led them into some difficulties. I also worry a bit on the upside, intermittently, not today, but I have worried a bit on the upside that the need for 2.0 as opposed to, say, 1.5 to 2.5 is going to make the Fed too slow on continuing its easing policy. That hasn't happened yet. It's a worry in the back of my head. So my recommendation for fixing the Fed is very modest. Change the 2% inflation target to 1.5 to 2.5. This is not a big deal.
So before I turn over to Carolyn, I'm gonna take a slightly different
Object to
position.
that. Go ahead.
No, not object to that. I have no problem with moving to the range. I have no problem whatsoever. But I think it's important to recognize that prior to 2020, the Fed actually tried to arrive at a neutral monetary policy. At the same time, they arrived at 2% inflation and full employment. And the framework and how they operationalized that framework changed that fundamentally. They were no longer trying to arrive at neutral full employment, 2% inflation at the same time. They were only going to start to tighten monetary policy once they arrived at 2% inflation. So I think that's a fundamental change. And I think it's a fundamental change that we can understand why it was motivated, because of the economy was soft and interest rates were low, inflation was soft. But, you know, to your point, Alan, I thought the 2019 environment was a pretty darn good environment. And so that was they probably threw the baby out with the bathwater a little bit too aggressively. Anyway, Carolyn.
So like a good Canadian, I'm gonna be in the middle of these two. So for sure, we can look at the situation and say, okay, we all got hit with COVID and we're looking into the abyss, so we acted forcefully, as about said. And then after that, we got hit with things that happened on the other side. Energy prices spiked. We had a series, it wasn't just one shock that lasted a year and a half, it was a series of rolling sort of shocks on the supply side that created wider spread supply issues and wider spread price increases that somehow many central banks didn't see. If you look at the report that Ben Bernanke did for the Bank of England, it's really hard to distinguish a winner there in terms of advanced economists who was the best forecaster, because they all looked really bad. And there's lots of reasons we could go into for that, but I think part of it is just we were fighting the last war, in the sense that we were looking for signs of inflation getting away from us on the downside, because we thought if we hit, if we have to give more stimulus, we've got nothing left. And that's a problem. Now, if inflation goes up a bit, it's okay, we know what to do, we'll just raise interest rates. And well, that's exactly what happened. Inflation did get away from a lot of jurisdictions, and they did have to raise interest rates, as you well know. And if you look at the charts, all very sharply and all quite a bit. So there's a lot there that's in common. I think there's some differences, though, that might shed light on this. Was it the framework, or was it just a bad forecast? And I don't have the answer just to set expectations, but I think it was a bit of both, because if you look at where the inflation was coming from, say you compare the US with Europe or the UK, studies show that a lot of the inflation for everyone was coming from the supply side, but for the US, it was more demand, so stimulation of the economy coming through fiscal policy and monetary policy than, say, in Europe. The fiscal response in Europe was much weaker, same with the UK. The UK and Europe were much more exposed to the energy price shock. Some of it was due to some countries in the EU being very dependent on Russian gas, but there were other things going on there that meant that there was more supply going on and I think that why that's important is that normally central bankers say, well, if we're sort of contributing to it, either directly from easy monetary policy or because we're accommodating easy fiscal policy, then we should probably react to that. The sort of wait and see or let it go through these temporary supply shocks, central banks with anchored expectations where people aren't going to be asking for more wages because they know it's temporary. Usually you don't react as forcefully to that. And so when I look at that, the US should have been reacting more forcefully than the others. And now when people say, well, who did it best? They usually think, well, who moved first, right? Who caught it first? Say in the autumn of 2021, central banks started to get visibly worried. Maybe they were worried before, but you could see it. And the Bank of England went first, then it was Bank of Canada, then Fed, and then the ECB, okay? I don't really think that tells the story that we need to look into if we want to know what really was going on in terms of how their frameworks and their operationalization of it affected their behavior. And so there's many ways to do it, and this isn't econometrics and identifying shocks, but one thing that really struck me was when you look at where was core inflation, so the underlying trend in inflation at the time of liftoff, when they decided to raise interest rates. And it was by a wide margin much higher in the US when they finally lift off. They just waited a lot longer than, say, than say, the Bank of Canada or the Bank of England did. And, you know, that's just one little data point, but you can dig into this and maybe it'd be for a good study, for somebody. Because I think that there are many reasons why central banks do different things, not related to their framework, but you could tell a story that I think Bill is trying to tell, which is, you know, the Fed didn't really have to, be that impatient because they said, well, we want an overshoot anyway. And we know what to do with inflation if it gets too high. We're just gonna raise interest rates. And in fact, it's kind of built in into our framework that we want to do that as a makeup strategy. So other central banks, like the ones I mentioned, they have a symmetrical inflation target anchored around 2. Some of them have a range, some of them don't, but they really say and have to care about inflation when it's above as much as they care about it when it's below. So I think the second thing is that the central banks I'm talking about that aren't the US have single mandates. They don't need to worry about full employment as a primary objective. Its primary objective is inflation, and you know these central banks aren't caring. They care about creating too much unemployment that's not needed, but it's not something that they need to trade off in the same way that the Fed does. So the Fed's job in many ways is a lot harder. And what struck me is in this framework, there was no way, and how they operationalized it, there was no way to see how they were going to make those trade-offs. Inflation's too high, but we're not sure we have full employment. It's the one situation where there is a trade-off, and there's nowhere to you see what guidance they're giving themselves or in the operationalization, how they were doing it. And I think that's also a problem if you want to anchor expectations, because people don't know what you're aiming for and they don't know the timelines either. So there is something, maybe it's not broken with the Fed system, but what they introduced may not be robust. It might be robust to a situation where you have downward pressure on inflation. But if you're thinking about a situation in the future when you're going to have more spikes in inflation coming, say, from geopolitical shocks or climate, other things, you know, maybe you want to think about a framework that would be robust to that.
Yeah, I think you want to have a framework that can respond to risks on both sides of the probability. The other thing that the Fed did that I think, you know, made them late was they set all these conditions for what had to happen before liftoff could occur. So first of all, quantitative easing had to end before they could lift off because they didn't want to be adding stimulus to quantitative easing and then raising interest rates, withdrawing stimulus by raising short-term rates. They made it a little bit even harder on themselves by saying, well, we can't just end quantitative easing. We have to taper quantitative easing. And I think the memories of Ben Bernanke's taper tantrum, I think, did inform the Fed to be very, very careful in terms of withdrawing from quantitative easing. So, you know, you can't start to lift off until you've finished with quantitative easing, and you can't end quantitative easing all at once. You have to taper it. You can see how this keeps pushing back the timing of liftoff. So Alan, you suggested that on the dual mandate, you know, objectives, weren't really arguing for a big change. You just said, let's have a range for inflation of 1.5% and 2.5% rather than 2%. Would you get rid of the makeup strategy though, as well? You know, in other words, if you have undershoots to inflation, you try to offset them with misses to the upside, or would you just go back to average inflation targeting?
No, I think I would probably, if I had a magic wand and I could rule the roost here, I think I would probably go back to bygones are bygones, and the target is 1.5 to 2.5.
Because you've complained in the past about how the overshooting issue was also very unclear, like how long do you look back for your undershoots of inflation? How far above inflation are you willing to go to offset misses to the downside? There was a lot of lack of clarity in terms of how this would actually be done.
A lot of people criticized the Fed in August 2020 for those reasons. I was one of them, because, you know, it said something like, I can't remember what the quantitative, but the timing was like for some time to overshoot, and then there was also an adjective on how much a small amount,
moderately, something like that.
Yeah, and they were basically meaningless terms. I mean, you didn't know what they meant.
So I mean, I guess, you know, what you could say here is communication is also important. So if you have a framework and then you can't communicate what that framework is clearly, that's also not gonna be helpful because people are gonna be confused about, well, where's monetary policy headed? Is the Fed gonna tolerate 3% inflation for a year, or are they gonna tolerate 4% inflation for 6 months? And I think that was pretty clear to people.
Yeah, I forgot to say at the beginning, these are my views and not the Bank of England's. Really important for me to do that, especially given what I'm gonna say. You know, I think the asymmetry, so worrying more if it's below 2% than above is problematic. I already said it, I think that it's not gonna be robust to what we're gonna face. I think the other problem there in the framework is the employment objective. I'm not suggesting that it be dropped, but I think that the way it's phrased, it's almost kind of guaranteeing you're gonna be late or behind the curve because it talks about shortfalls to, I'm looking at the wording, minimize the shortfalls to employment relative to full employment, as opposed to just saying, you know what, we're gonna try to have an employment rate or NAIRU at a rate that's consistent with 2% inflation, that's got a future element in it. Maybe like I'm splitting hairs, but I think when you look at the behavior, it was part of it. The other thing that I would clarify.
The broad and inclusive language.
That's what I was just gonna get there. It's the broad and inclusive, and there's no one is gonna be against full employment and broad and inclusive full employment. The thing is, it doesn't match with the Fed tools. That's not something the Fed can achieve, and so the only way they can maybe try to squeeze more employment, they can't choose where it comes from, and it's gonna be at the cost of higher inflation or the risk of a lot higher inflation, and so I think that just hands out, it's like a mandate creep in a sense that I don't think serves them well. They can't deliver it, and it might lead to some errors. On this communication bit, communication it's about people understanding what you're doing and why you're doing it. I think in a world, it's always been important, but in a world where accountability for delegated authority is becoming more and more important, and central bank independence seems to be, not just in the US, but elsewhere, being questioned, that the clearer you can be about what your objective is, the simpler it is, the simpler you can say, this is what we're doing, and then after you can say, this is what I did, and we succeeded or we didn't, you can see it, the better it is for your accountability. And accountability of the parliament, the people that may not be in the details every day and understand the nuances of what you're trying to achieve. And so for that reason, I think it's even more important that framework is simplified and clarified.
No, I agree with that. I also think it's helpful to be as clear as possible so the market can think along with with the central bank and anticipate what the central bank's going to do. I mean, you know, people always talk about the long and variable lags of monetary policy. That's true. But if market participants know what the Fed's going to react to and why, they can start to price in tightening or easing before the Federal Reserve actually reacts. And that can actually shorten the legs of monetary policy, make monetary policy more effective.
And they have.
Yeah.
It has happened, what you just said.
Yeah, but that's why communication is really important. And so I think what you're hearing from us is simplify the communication as much as possible. Try not to confuse people. And I think there's pretty strong support here for just going, you know, keep it simple, stupid, 2% inflation, always try to hit 2% inflation and.
Or some range.
Or some range. Yeah, I think Alan's point is really well taken that, you know, when you're at 1.7 as opposed to 2, that's probably mostly just noise in the system,
Yeah.
measurement error, things like that. Or whether you got hit with a bad, bird flu, which drove up the cost of eggs or drove down the cost of eggs when the bird flu abated. And so you probably don't want to be reacting to things like that. The average voter the average business isn't going to be able to parse out whether it's running 1.7 or 2, but they are going to be able to parse out if it's running 3 or 4.
So you talked about operationalization, and I was intrigued that both of you kind of did, there's a given framework, you can change it, it's not gonna fix everything. It's also about how you operationalize it, and that includes, how you weight different risks, how you make trade-offs, but also the Fed's toolbox, the communications part, the QE, the market interventions they did. Do you think the framework should change or be made in that direction?
Well, I think they need to broaden the framework. I mean, right now, the framework is all focused on the federal funds rate that we're gonna pick relative to our employment and inflation objectives. Well, they have this whole other tool of monetary policy, QE and QT, that they've used pretty aggressively over the last 15 years. And there literally is no framework for QE or QT. There's no framework about, when do we use it? Why do we use it? Do we use it for market functioning? Do we use it to provide additional monetary policy stimulus? How do we evaluate the cost and benefits of doing additional quantitative easing? And when we decide to unwind QE, what kind of portfolio do we want to return to? And how are we gonna get there? So I think, one of my critiques of the Fed would be that the framework they have is, one, fighting the last war, so they need to change it to be able to fight wars on both sides of the probability distribution. But two, it needs to be broader. It should be including all the monetary policy tools, not just the interest rate tool.
Now, you correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I don't believe the Fed wants QE thought of as a permanent tool, the way it thinks of as the short-term interest rate, that it was rolled out in an emergency. They're now doing QT, sucking it back out of the Fed's balance sheet towards some number. You're right, what number is that? It may not be zero. And if it's not zero, why is it not zero, and how do you think about that? But I don't think in terms of the conceptualization of monetary policy, they're thinking, oh, we have these two tools.
Well, the reason why I think it's important, Alan, is because quantitative easing programs the Federal Reserve took is going to cost the US taxpayer somewhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion. Now, it seems to me if you're spending $500 billion or $1 trillion, you probably want to have a framework to sort of guide you on the expenditures that you ultimately made. Now, the Fed had no idea it was going to cost this much.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go back and look at the Solomon Management annual report in 2022, they thought if interest rates were 100 basis points higher than they forecast, they were going to have like a small loss for a year. But my point is, if you're undertaking a policy that's ultimately going to cost the taxpayer a considerable amount of money, I think it behooves you for your legitimacy to have a framework so you can justify why you did what you did.
Well, I wouldn't argue against that.
So,
I want to put one more thing into the hopper that is relevant to several things that were said, but hasn't really been brought up, which is the death of the Phillips curve. So to do monetary policy the way we've always traditionally tried to do monetary policy, you have to have at least some ability to forecast inflation and relate that to the shortfalls or the excesses of unemployment above the natural rate. That's just completely broken down. And not only in the United States. It actually was, back in the good old days, it worked better in the United States than anywhere else. And I guess you could say we joined the rest of the world, but it hasn't. And what that means practically is that the tools you have to forecast inflation down the road where today's monetary policy will actually be having its effect a year or two from now are pretty poor. And that leads, that has led, and here's where it relates to the framework. That has led some people, including myself, in desperation to go back to what I've called the Bunker Hill strategy, which is you don't fire until you see the whites of inflation's eyes, which you just pointed out can lead you astray. And if inflation is going up, it will lead you astray. You will be late with the Bunker Hill strategy. And that's why I, for decades, way favored the Phillips curve strategy. But when the Phillips curve doesn't work any longer, in desperation, you may have to turn back to the Bunker Hill strategy.
Yeah, we don't have a really great model of inflation right now. It looks like inflation depends mainly on inflation expectations. And then the question is, what does inflation expectations depend on?
It depends mostly on inflation.
No, I'm not a modeler, so full disclosure, I'm a user of the model results. One thing about the models that central banks tend to use is that the wage and price generation process is highly simplified in a way that in normal times kind of allows you to fit the data, and all that just means it's a fancy way of saying your forecast isn't gonna be that bad. And then the response of prices to your, whatever you do with interest rates isn't gonna be that off either. Of course, that helps if inflation expectations are anchored. The problem is that when you have big shocks or shocks like COVID, when that way firms and people who are working change how they're thinking about changing their wage demands or changing their prices, then that's not gonna look at all like the model. And so, and what happened in COVID, I think, wasn't so much the wage side, it was the price setting side, where firms normally wouldn't pass on all their costs. But for some reason, I don't know all the research, but looking at some for Sweden right now, and all of a sudden, instead of passing on part of the cost, they passed on not only all of the costs, they passed on costs that they actually didn't face, but their neighbor did, because people were just accepting them. There was no competition, and so, well, there's no model no forecasting model is gonna see that. It's gonna be a conversation with those businesses who aren't gonna tell the central bank that they're raising prices more than they usually do. They're certainly not gonna tell you that they're increasing their profit margins at the wrong time. And so I think this notion that you can have a very simple, single, elegant model to tell you everything you need to know is gone. Because there's a lot going under the hood in areas like supply chains, like price setting behavior that we just don't see normally.
And the models have lots of assumptions that lead to big shocks have very small consequences. The models assume that everyone understands the Fed's always gonna follow the optimal monetary policy. And because the Fed always is gonna follow the optimal monetary policy, inflation expectations are always well anchored. And since inflation expectations are always well anchored, it's really hard to get a lot of inflation. So there's some elements of the models themselves that create some issues. Communications, anything you change from the Fed in terms of how they communicate either their objectives or how they operationalize policy or.
Well, if they change their objective, they need to communicate that. So I would be talking about the point to arrange. If they change the shortfalls, they need to communicate that. By the way, I'm not so big on changing the shortfalls. The central bank is already, tech talk for a second, in their loss function. That's monk talk for meaning the things they don't like. We already have inflation. So that's a reason to care about not having employment too high, inflation, and you certainly should care about that. And for many central banks, it's clearly the primary. And even at the Fed, it's the primary, even though they don't say it, and it's not in the law. The reasons that economists, probably alone in the world, worry about having too much employment are all about inefficiencies here and there that are probably not that large quantitatively, and that nobody understands and cares about except a bunch of economists. So that's what you lose. You lose a bunch of economists when you go to shortfalls instead of a more symmetric look at where is employment relative to full employment. That doesn't seem like such a big loss to me.
Well,
But it needs to be communicated, as you say.
But coming back to your point about the Phillips curve being very flat, that also makes it really hard to find out where it actually is, where full employment actually is. And
Right.
And clearly, I think everyone accepts the notion that you shouldn't be keeping people unemployed just because you think you might be at full employment. I mean, so I think everybody agrees that you want to sort of probe for where full employment is because it's sort of, but probing for full employment though also doesn't mean that you keep interest rates at zero until you.
Well, let's be concrete about the point you just made. It's been quite a few months. I used to know the number, but it must be in the 30s by now, where the lead digit on the unemployment rate has either been 3 or 4. And if you'd have brought up a number like that in the year 2000 as a target for the Federal Reserve, you'd have been run out of town as a crazy inflationist. Turned out not to be crazy at all.
Yep, and the Federal Reserve and their estimates of full employment have consistently bringing it down. Now it's around 4%, right where we are today.
Yeah.
We're gonna open for questions just in a minute, but I want to ask both of you about Fed independence. Obviously, that's issue, people are worried about, Trump administration, President Trump in particular, has talked about, firing Jay Powell, although he's backed away from that. How do you think about Fed independence? Number one, the importance of Fed independence, and two, what's the best way to the Fed to act in a way that makes sure that they can keep that independence going forward?
Well, we don't make money out of gold anymore, but sovereigns can still clip the currency, as they've done for centuries. And that's the fundamental reason why you want central banks to be independent of politics. There are other concepts of independence, but we're talking about independence of politics. I worry hugely about Fed independence under Trump. As maybe not everybody in this room knows, one of his I was about to say his latest thing. I'm sure he did something 10 minutes ago that I have no idea. One of his latest things is an executive order that says the independent agencies across the board aren't independent anymore. In case you think that excludes the Fed, it does not. It includes the Fed. That would go exactly to the point of, can he fire the head of the Fed, which we all think the answer is no. And under current law, the answer is no.
Although it's interesting, he made actually a very subtle distinction there. He said that I'm going to take away the independence of the Fed with respect to supervision and regulation, but I'm going to keep it there for monetary policy. That's what he actually said. Now, like you said, today he could have said something different, but he did actually make that. So how do you behave as a central bank to ensure you maintain your independence?
Well, you use your delegated authority, which is what it is, it's delegated independence. There's an old book that was written that's called The Myth of Independence or something. The Fed has constraints. It's not like it's running with scissors. But you need to take that seriously and be very clear and accountable for what you do. So that's kind of, those are table stakes. I think what's on my mind is just how it feels the discourse is like, well, we need to do it because, you know, the Fed is special and it's all about the Fed needs its independence because that's what it wants. It's really about us, everybody in the room and everybody outside the room in different countries, because if bondholders get nervous that given where the federal government debt is in the US and the plans to keep it high and maybe growing, there's going to be market discipline, and it happens really fast. I saw it happen in the UK in the fall of 2022. The thing that made that ship right itself in 2022, when people were worried about fiscal sustainability in the UK, was maybe our intervention of the Bank of England, but it was the fact that no one believed that the Bank of England would accommodate a fiscal track like that we would not let inflation get out of control. If you don't have independence and people worry that you're going to beggar your neighbor, which is what is called in the textbooks, you're going to get hammered. And even if you are the reserve currency, it's going to be disruptive. And so I think it's important for everyone. Independence comes with responsibility and accountability, but take it away in this circumstance, I think it's pretty dangerous.
I think, you know, the way I would say you maintain your independence is you have a very clear framework for what you're trying to achieve. You have a very clear articulation of how you're going to operationalize it, and you then behave it consistent with what you said you're going to do over time. And then people are comfortable that you're going to take the long run interest of the economy in perspective. You're not going to play politics with the electoral cycle. And if you do that, people have confidence in you. It's very interesting watching the Democrats and Republicans deal with the Fed over the last 30, 40 years. The Democrats, starting with Bob Rubin, and you were very involved with the Clinton administration, but with Bob Rubin, was basically, we're never going to say anything critical of the Fed. Because to Carolyn's point, there's no upside. All it does, if we say something critical of the Fed, is it unnerves markets. And since that time, you've noticed the Democrats have been always silent. And Joe Biden, I don't think ever said anything really critical of the Fed, even during this spike in inflation. And when the Fed, you could, you know, we can argue about where the inflation came from. And a lot of it was the supply shock. But, you know, it is interesting that Biden didn't blame the Fed at all for what happened.
Absolutely right. By the way, you said Bob Rubin, you should have said Bill Clinton.
Well, Bob Rubin convinced Bill Clinton. Right. That's how it worked.
Unlike other economists that have tried to convince previous presidents and did.
I think we could talk forever.
Yes, or let's it open. I'm sure you have a lot of questions. May.
Thank you so much, all three of you. I don't think this is on.
Ed, it's on.
It is.
No, it is.
It's fascinating remarks. You know, the inflation that the United States went through and just climbed out, reminds me of something that happens in healthcare, that you have a patient and team of physicians treating the patient. But then very often, you know, the physicians will misdiagnose or misdiagnose what the disease is. You mean that, and that said, I would like to pick up something that Carolyn said earlier and what Alan said earlier. Carolyn, you mentioned that the what was driving US inflation was demand, which I mean, you know, I agree as a layperson, and this is the point that Paul Krugman made over and over. And so the question is, would it have been possible for the Fed and policymakers to you know to have seen that timely and taken measures?
It was certainly
Okay.
possible. I mean, Paul Krugman, we're at, Carol and I were writing a paper on this whole issue for the Group of 30, and I uncovered this editorial by Paul Krugman in, I think it was December of 2020, where Paul Krugman basically said, with the introduction of vaccines, the economy is going to come roaring back much faster than anybody anticipates. So literally 15 months before the Fed lift off, Paul Krugman was already talking about how the economy is going to be much stronger than expected. The secret sauce for the US was $5 trillion of fiscal stimulus transfers to households and businesses.
I need to say, can I just, I just wanna temper what he said, because I'm not sure, yes, there were people calling it,
There were.
and I think anybody looking back with hindsight would say you were late. At the time, they might have seen it, but I think that the worry then was, yeah, we might overshoot. I'm back to the framework, we might overshoot a bit. I see it coming, but I don't see it coming if you look at the forecast as much as it actually did. Partly because I didn't think fiscal policy would be as stimulative as it was, not because of the size, but because I just think, you know, people are not gonna spend. And then they also thought that some of these supply side things would just fall out of inflation and that would faster than they did. And I think it's about what they saw, and they also weren't looking for inflation because I look at different central banks, what they said and the scenarios that they were running, there was very little on the upside risk to inflation.
Yeah, it's very interesting when the 2020 transcripts come out,
What they were thinking about.
what they were thinking in real time as you went through the COVID
Yeah,
period.
I know you wanna.
Unfortunately, we only have the transcripts through
And this
2019.
relates to my question for Alan. Alan, you mentioned that clearly they made a mistake, they misjudged the real situation. And this reminds me of, there was a webinar that was between Merv King, who was the former Bank of England head, and either Paul Krugman or Larry Summers. And Merv's opening remarks was that, you know, I think that policymakers should, in terms of gauging inflation, should go out there and look what is happening and talk to people. And instead of building their models, so I thought he was hinting at the Fed, at us, you know, the US.
Well, maybe, the problem with that always sounds right, the problem is, who do you talk to? There are a lot of people out there and you get different answers. And that's why we have a Bureau of Labor Statistics that goes around and collects thousands and thousands of prices.
And people consistently experience inflation is higher than the actual inflation
Yeah, that's another
statistics
thing.
that are reported. If you look at all the surveys over time.
I just wanted to get in a sentence or two on this thing that it was aggregate demand. Some of this is definitional and using vocabulary in different ways. But what really drove the inflation up is that the surge in aggregate demand could not be met by the supply side the way it normally would be. Because there weren't enough containers, there weren't enough trucks, there weren't enough truckers, and right down the line. And this lasted, to Carolyn's last point, longer than a lot of people thought.
Yeah,
Oh, I left out the longest, like port capacity.
there's also,
Yeah,
the-
you could raise port capacity. It takes 2 years or something.
there's also the shift in the
But why-
composition of demand
Yeah,
to goods away from services.
Yes, that's why you needed all these trucks and things.
But why did policymakers not see that price was going up, which signals inflation?
They did, they were
But too
slow.
late, too late.
Yeah, they were slow. I started there. They were slow.
So the one thing, just to,
We should go,
We should get another
yeah, another
question.
one, yeah, there's,
Yeah, quick question for each of you. Fascinating discussion. I appreciate the context. Of course, as we all know, hindsight is 2020. It's obviously what we should have done. Now you did the mentioning of Krugman's column in December of 2020. It looks sort of obvious now, right? I mean, we should have maybe started raising rates shortly thereafter, although you have to think mindset, December of 2020, things were pretty scary at that stage still. I mean, the idea that the Fed was going to start raising rates maybe in January of 21 or, maybe the first, I mean, that's
No, I
probably
think, I think it's maybe middle of the year.
well, maybe middle of the year, whatever, but even then, it's like, again, 2020. But with all that said, what you said, I'd be just curious to know, in the current climate, we have sort of sticky inflation-ish, maybe, is it gonna have last? And, combine that with, I was just looking at broad money supply. I don't know if anyone pays attention to that anymore at the Fed, but M2, year over year, inflation is sort of stabilized, even though until very recently, the trend in M2 has really come down a lot, obviously from a very high peak. But in the current climate, you now have M2 going up trend wise, inflation sort of sticky. You couldn't get inflation much lower so far, even though M2 was sort of collapsing trend wise. Now it's going up. How do you think about sticky inflation? Broad money supply now is obviously for a while now is rebounded. I mean, what's the context? How do you think about this if you're at the Fed right now?
Well, let's start with money supply. My view may be pretty radical relative to Carolyn and Alan, but money supply growth in my mind is really not very important indicator anymore. And the reason for that is money supply growth is pushed around by whether you're doing quantitative easing or whether you're doing quantitative tightening. When you do quantitative easing, the Fed is going out and buying securities. People that get those securities now have cash, they put it in their banks as deposits, M2 goes up. Fed's doing quantitative tightening, it all runs in reverse. But quantitative easing and quantitative tightening, to the best that economists can measure it, isn't really very powerful. So the M's may be moving around quite a bit, but the actual effect of quantitative easing, quantitative tightening on the real economy is very modest, in my opinion.
I basically agree with that. I would take that and raise you one.
Sure.
That what you said is true, but M2 was doing no good for anybody making monetary policy way before anybody started QE and QT. And this is an old story that goes back decades. So the way you started your question, does anyone at the Fed pay much attention to M2? I don't. Well, there are thousands of people there, but pretty much nobody.
Bundesbank pays attention to them.
Well, they say they do. They don't, but they say that they do. And that's as exemplified by some of the rest of your question when it said, well, M2 was going up, but there wasn't inflation. Now M2 is going down and the inflation stopped going down. These kinds of things have been happening for decades. The correlation between M2 and inflation has been zero for quite a while now.
The Fed's theory of the case right now, and I'm gonna channel Chairman Powell, is that monetary policy is still somewhat restrictive. The economy is at full employment, and with a moderately restrictive monetary policy, that will gradually continue to push inflation down. And if Powell sees what he expects, inflation falls, then the Federal Reserve can follow inflation down by cutting interest rates over time. The argument against that is, well, the economy seems to be doing pretty well. And so maybe monetary policy isn't as restrictive as Powell thinks it is. And there's a view at the Fed that maybe policy isn't tight at all. And in that case, there's no reason to cut rates because Monetary policy is pretty close to neutral as we stand right now. And that's really the debate that's going on within the Fed right now.
Yeah, I would emphasize what you started with, which is hindsight's 2020, and yes, there were people saying things, but you're right, in December 2020, actually, even after that, it was still a scary place, since in jurisdictions where the vaccine hadn't been rolled out yet. I wish money would work as an indicator. It's really elegant. I even tried to make it work for many years when I was at the Bank of Canada. It's my first job there. It just doesn't, you can find periods where it works and it looks good, but it's such an unreliable friend. That relationship breaks down a lot for the reasons they said. I think what to look for, and I want to see more of this, there are experiments that show what would have happened, let's just say in June 2021, if they had started raising interest rates, and given everything else that happened afterwards, what would have inflation looked like? And I expect it would have been a little lower. Maybe the terminal rate would have been a little lower as well. Speed might have been lower, but I don't think it would have changed the level of prices that people are feeling. Because they're not feeling inflation, they're feeling like that everything is still really expensive. The price level has risen. I think that still would have been there. It's not an excuse. I'm just saying we don't want to estimate how consequential being late was.
I think, I think to me, the biggest risk of being late was not so much that you got a lot more inflation, but there was a risk that inflation expectations were going to become unanchored because you were late. People would start to lose confidence in the Fed's ability to do their job. And one of the very favorable developments of the last couple of years that wasn't really fully predictable was that inflation expectations would stay very well anchored despite a very strong upward surge in inflation. And that made the Fed's job dramatically easier. So I would argue that, yeah, they wouldn't have had a lot more inflation, a lot less inflation if they tightened earlier, but they were taking risks by being late in terms of inflation expectations. Yeah. Those risks didn't materialize, but I think they were real risks.
Just to Carolyn's, they had one sentence. David Rentschler, who used to run the big Fed model, he's now retired from the Fed, there's a very good paper in which he did exactly what you said. Let's run the model and assume that monetary policy tightens sooner. What difference would it make? And it's exactly what you said. Tiny difference, lower inflation.
We had Russia.
Yeah, and many other things.
How much longer do you want to go, Dana?
Okay, good. We'll do one. I wanted to at least get.
Thank you very much. I just want to exactly follow on the last point. It feels to me that we're discussing things that actually don't matter that much in the sense of like we're talking about mistakes that caused the inflation maybe like 3% higher for half a year or like maybe 3 months. But is there a real risk, a real possibility of this whole anchoring being gone so that this like whole stock of confidence from the Volcker era breaking down and then we don't even kind of have like our current the New Keynesian model we learn in PhD classes don't even cover that kind of situation. Like is that a real possibility, especially given the fiscal and like trade policies that can introduce a lot of like cost push inflation that is this something that the people in the Fed are really concerned about? And
well, that's why you'll never hear Powell say anything but we're going to push inflation back down to 2%. He doesn't. There's no ever excuses. Well, the tariffs could push up prices for a while, or something could happen on fiscal policy. No, we're always going to push inflation back down to 2% because he doesn't want to get inflation expectations unanchored. And so as we accompany, as we find out what tariff policy is actually going to be over the next, 6 months or so, the Fed's going to be very, very focused on inflation expectations. If they stay well anchored, the Fed can look through those effects on tariffs on the price level. If they don't stay well anchored, then the Federal Reserve is going to have to take those the tariffs into account. And I think the real answer today is we don't really know how that's going to play out.
I think you're asking a very good question. Two things that we know. One, looking backwards, inflationary expectations as measured by tips never went up that much. They did go up, but it was like inflation went to 9 and expectations went to 3 or something. So that looked really good news for the Fed. If you want to worry about losing control over inflationary expectations, you go back to what might happen if monetary policy gets made in the White House.
Well, this is the Arthur Burns story that, I mean, the way you characterize Chairman Powell's view is, I wanna behave aggressively enough, so I don't have to ever be accused of being Arthur Burns. Because Arthur Burns basically didn't get rid of the uptick in inflation expectations. What happened cycle after cycle, inflation expectations were rising, and then Paul Volcker came in 1979 and had to really.
The sheriff came to town.
Exactly. One more question?
Yeah, Bill, on this question of independence, which kind of comes to what you're talking about. You noted that the executive order is focused on supervision, not monetary policy. So, thinking about how to preserve the Fed's independence on monetary policy, like the administration seems to be fairly transactional. Is it necessary that the Fed do supervision if it came down to it? Would you give up supervision? This came up, I remember in the Greenspan era, and Greenspan made.
Dodd-Frank Act, there was discussion about
Yeah.
taking away supervision from the Fed during the Dodd-Frank Act. So the argument for the Fed doing supervision, I think, comes down to the notion that to have an effective monetary policy, you need financial stability. To understand what's happening in terms of risk and financial stability, you need to have some understanding of the banking system and financial markets. So the Fed's argument would be like, we need to be able to understand what's happening in the financial system to be able to assess financial stability risk. But other countries have different approaches. I mean, in England, they pushed them together, then they pulled them apart, and so
They
they're.
do that.
Then they put
It's
it
a
together.
pendulum. When the Bank of England makes a mistake, they take it away. When the external authority makes a mistake, they bring it back. But you do need that coordination, but in other countries, they don't. Like Canada doesn't do prudential regulation, it's another office, but there's a mechanism. There's a small number of regulators, so there's a mechanism that we all talk, and there's a financial stability and a mandate that's given to that group. As opposed to a separate entity like the FSOC. And so I'm not saying it works perfectly, but I think other governance structures can work really well. The key though is that there's communication and it's clear whose tools are whose. Microprudential, there's other tools that are financial stability like tools that the Fed should still keep.
I mean, one of the problems we have in the United States is we have this huge giant capital markets, and the SEC does not have a financial stability objective. So we basically give all the security stuff to an agency that doesn't even think about financial stability at all. That's a problem. We need someone to be thinking about financial stability from a macro perspective. And so if it's not the Fed, who is it? Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation? That's a pretty narrow view of financial stability. That's really about risk to loss to the FDIC reserve fund. So I think the US has a problem, and the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which I think in theory is a good idea, in practice isn't very effective because the agencies don't really want the Financial Stability Oversight Council to be effective, because if it's effective, it's limiting their prerogatives of the individual agencies. So it's almost designed to fail by the construction, unfortunately. Leave it there on that really optimistic note.
There's a woman right behind
Okay.
that also, I think we should take her question.
Okay,
and then-
fine, I agree with you, absolutely.
Hello, thank you for this amazing talk. I just wanted to ask, following the Bernanke review at the Bank of England, there were some recommendations of improving the forecast and updating the models. I was just wondering whether you think this could also be applied to the Fed, or Fed should take into account some of this.
Yeah, there are definitely issues with the Fed's communication of their forecasts. The summary of economic projections is a bit of a mess. Can you want to take that? It's a non-Fed.
I'm not gonna use the word mess. I thought that the Bernanke review of the Bank of England was really well done and focused, and the focus on the forecasting, the way they do it was quite useful. The things that I think are the most, I mean, the Fed has an amazing team. They devote a lot of resources. They're highly respected in the banking community. What's a little bit different is the communications of the Federal Reserve in terms of the forecast. You get the staff forecast 5 years later, thank you very much. And you get this other document that just basically has a dot plot and then some ranges of expectations, but you have no single forecast that is consistent with output and employment and inflation and interest rates. And I think that makes it really hard to communicate why you're doing what you're doing and how is it linked to your economic forecast. There's different ways to do it. I think that there's no one perfect way, but how the Bank of England does it or the ECB, not bad models to just see what parts are best. And I think that would be a good way for the Fed to do it. I think doing scenarios, that was the other thing, is that we always have this thing about uncertainty, and central banks love to do fan charts that says, well, inflation could be 2, or it could be 10, or minus 10. Great. Okay, that's helpful. But what people can relate to, and I think illustrates how policy might change, is to do scenarios if different things happen, say with oil prices or with tariffs. And doing that and incorporating it in your documentation, whether it's a monetary policy or some report or something else, like other central banks do, could be really powerful.
Yeah, the constraint on the Fed is basically, Ben Bernanke tried to get the Fed to actually move to a monetary policy report where the FOMC would say, here's our forecast for the economy. And it just didn't get anywhere. And it didn't get anywhere because for a whole variety of reasons. One reason was, gee, how much do I have to agree with it before I say yes versus disagreement with it and dissent? But I think a more fundamental reason was that the Federal Reserve Bank presidents didn't like this. Because if there was going to be a forecast, this was going to be a forecast that would be driven out of Washington, and it was going to make the role of the reserve banks even more diminished than it is today. Now this, you'll never find this written down anywhere, but as someone who was at the table when we were having those discussions, I'm highly confident that that was an important reason. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming. Thank you for tolerating the audio.